Hello, I'm Leslie Chapman Henderson, President and CEO of FLASH, the nonprofit Federal Alliance for Safe Homes. I'm going to be your host today for our podcast, Strong Homes, Safe Families, where we help you prepare for disasters of all kinds. Today, we're talking about the 2018 Anchorage, Alaska earthquake, and I'm delighted to welcome our guest, Amanda Siok. Amanda is the Earthquake, Tsunami, and Volcano Program Manager for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Welcome, Amanda.
Thanks so much for having me, Leslie.
Well, it's great to have you here. Now, before we get started, one of the favorite parts of our podcast is when we get to learn about our guests. Can you tell me about yourself, your background, and anything you want to throw in there to share about your professional journey that brought you to FEMA?
Sure. I work for FEMA Region X, which is based in the Seattle area of Washington. And I grew up in the area. And if you're familiar with the Pacific Northwest, you know that it's beautiful here and we have a gorgeous range of mountains. And, when the weather's clear, the mountains are out and those mountains are volcanoes. And volcanoes are created by earthquakes. And so I just kind of grew up thinking about earthquakes. And I've just been kind of a rock nerd. And when I went to college, I was an English major and I needed some science credits. And I started taking geology classes, and they took you hiking and you got credit for it. And I just loved learning about the science behind what created this beautiful area. And after learning about, I was in Seattle for the Nisqually earthquake, and I've felt numerous quakes, and, seeing our Alaskan Way viaduct, which was the same as the structure that collapsed in the San Francisco, in Loma Prieta during the World Series. It was the same structure. And so seeing that and seeing, that we knew that it was vulnerable, and it took so long for the city and the state to replace it. And that was done. And, it's great now. But I ended up pursuing urban planning. I'm just trying to understand that interplay between science and the built environment. And so here I am today.
Wow, that is so interesting. And it's such a common thread I find in the people that we work with who have expertise like yours and how it starts. With the weather service and the meteorologists, sometimes it's because they went through a hurricane. And in the earthquake space, I often speak with people that have gone through an earthquake, and it becomes a passion that translates into a career. So that's just very, very interesting. And I think that passion, though, is also one of the critical aspects of why you're successful. So talk to me a little bit about your specific role at FEMA and up in Region X and what you're engaged with today.
Yeah, sure. So my job, there's many different elements, but I would say I work with communities and tribes, so state government, local, county, tribal governments, and I help them understand their vulnerability to natural hazards, so mainly earthquakes, tsunamis, and volcanoes. And so I work with geologists and various earth scientists to map those hazards and, understand the geology that we're working with. And then I work with engineers to understand the impacts of those hazards on the built environment. And then I work with planners, urban planners, city planners, land use planners, to understand the social and economic impacts of those hazards. So once we have, this understanding of all of the bad things that can happen, then I work with them to try and find solutions and funding to fix those problems or how to prevent them to begin with. So, finding safer places to build or using stronger or more resistant building materials.
Interesting. So anyone who's ever been there knows, and I've had the pleasure of visiting Alaska once, it is one of our most beautiful and incredible states in the U.S. But there are, as you mentioned before, the beautiful mountains. It does present some unique conditions that can also make it difficult when it comes to helping the public get ready for disasters. And then when they happen, those same things that make it beautiful can also present tremendous challenges with respect to first responders and getting to people in need. So can you talk a little bit about some of those unique challenges and the conditions in Alaska that make it it's a big challenge, and it's also something you really need to understand to do well if you're gonna help there.
Yeah, so you're right. Alaska is absolutely beautiful. And I think part of what makes it so beautiful is the mountains, the terrain there. It's so wild and so close to people. So the state itself is huge, and it's with that comes a lot of remoteness. So you've got fast changing weather coming off of the ocean, but there's a lack of roads in general. There's a lot of places in Alaska that can only be accessed by boat, which freezes over in the winter, or by plane. And planes are hard to use when it's really windy or foggy. So there's a lot of logistical issues in accessing different areas, and the size of it makes it, harder to move from one place to another.
When I visited there, I heard a statistic that 1 in 7 Alaskans knew how to pilot a seaplane.
That's so impressive.
By necessity. And I thought, wow, that is, I'm not sure I could handle that, but I thought that was, I guess, because you don't have a continuous highway system in Alaska. You cannot drive to every area of Alaska, correct? You have to some have to be traveled by boat.
Yeah.
So it's just amazing. So with that in mind, what are some of the ways that FEMA and the community of leaders that you work with have adapted to those conditions?
Yeah,
Do you have a seaplane? Do you guys have a sea?
Yeah, the FEMA scuba team, actually. No, we do have an actual office in Anchorage. It's our Alaska area office, just because we know it takes time to get from the lower 48 up there to begin with. So having a staff in Anchorage that are more familiar with all things Alaska certainly help us out. We have Alaska specific response plans as well. So we'll do exercises fairly routinely with the state of Alaska to understand the uniquenesses of the state and their logistical challenges. We've often partnered with like the Civil Air Patrol after an event to have them go and fly their planes. So FEMA doesn't fly the planes. We have someone else do that for us. But, they'll take images for us so that we can better understand how, what the situation is on the ground. We also have a specific tribal coordinator position in Alaska. So there are so many Alaska Native villages spread throughout the state, and they have their own way of communicating. And so we have a person dedicated to working with them to understand their needs and how we can best support them.
Oh, that makes a great deal of sense. And so we talked about the disasters that can occur in Alaska. Can you talk a little bit about some of the specific events that have helped shape its history?
Yeah, sure. So Alaska, there's the Aleutian Chain, which is, a string of volcanic islands. So I don't know how many times I get just email updates from the volcano observatories up there saying, we've got some rumbling here, and, there may or may not be an advisory for aircraft. So there's volcanoes, there is tsunami vulnerability because of the sheer size of the coastline in Alaska. There's tsunami vulnerability, both local from local volcanic activity as well as distant, so coming from Japan. And then because of the mountains, there's earthquakes. I think most famously is the 1964 earthquake, but there was also an earthquake that damaged the town of Valdez so significantly that they actually moved the town over a little bit so that it was safer. So Alaska has vibrant history of dealing with natural phenomena, natural disasters, and earthquakes and tsunamis.
So I think you're right. I think a lot of people had heard, we probably don't know that many details about the 1964 earthquake. And then you had a significant earthquake in 2018. Can you kind of just talk about those two together and compare and contrast them? Because it seems like that was the milestone was 2018. But before that, we always heard the referral back to 1964 when it came to Alaska.
Yeah, so the 1964 earthquake was huge. It was a magnitude 9.2. That's a huge earthquake, and it shook for 4 full minutes. So that's a long time to be ducking and covering under your desk or your table with, things falling and breaking around you.
That's a long duration earthquake in addition to the magnitude. Wow.
Exactly. So in that earthquake, it was also a fairly shallow earthquake. It was 15 miles deep, whereas the one in Anchorage in 2018 was much deeper. So the 1964 earthquake, because of its size and duration, it crumbled a lot of buildings. It damaged a lot of roads. But the benefit of that, if you will, was that it knocked down a lot of the vulnerable buildings to earthquakes. So Alaska had a bit of a clean slate to start with. And so they did rebuild with seismic design in mind. And then the 2018 earthquake that they had was a magnitude 7.1. And it happened, so that's smaller than the 64 event. And it also shook for less than 30 seconds. So you had a deeper earthquake, which means that the shaking wasn't as intense. You had a smaller magnitude and shorter duration. So those 3 factors make the earthquake less damaging right there. There was no tsunami from that either. And it was winter though. So it happened at 8:30 in the morning, and it's winter, so there's snow, and in the winter in Alaska, the sun doesn't come up until later. So it was dark. And so we actually didn't have good images of what the damage actually was until around 9:45. So a little bit after, an hour after the earthquake.
Were the buildings, you talked about a bit of a clean slate construction wise coming out of 1964. Were any of those buildings constructed with seismic design tested in the 2018 event? Was there any ability to gauge success or resilience with those more modern buildings?
Yeah, there was. And actually, there's a great YouTube video that was produced on it. The Atwood building in downtown Anchorage. It's ATWOOD. But that building was designed for seismic motion, and it was actually there were sensors in it. And so after the earthquake, we were actually able to look at the sensors and see how that building performed. And the building performed exactly as expected in the earthquake, and they were able to keep functionality of the building and go right back to work.
I think I'm aware. I've seen that promoted before out of FEMA, and that's something as part of the podcast. We'll find that link and put that in the show notes for our listeners so they can watch that as well, because that's impressive. And that's the kind of visual evidence that's very compelling and helps all of us remember why it's so important to build it right the first time. And of course, the way we get to that ideal recipe for construction that's resilient no matter what disasters through building codes. So in Anchorage, where they were hit in 2018, do they have the building codes in place for residential and commercial, or some of them? And if so, did it affect the outcome, like the Atwood building, obviously, but was there additional impact, that was measured by the codes?
Yeah. So before I get into building codes, I think, and it might be helpful for our listeners to understand, that skeleton song about the foot bone being connected to the leg bone, and then the leg bone's connected to the knee bone. And then yes. Everything has to be connected in order to function properly. So like when you injure your ankle, you often end up with back pain because you're limping and just things are out of alignment. And the same is true for buildings. So especially for earthquakes, the foundation, the walls, and the roof, they all have to be connected properly to ensure public safety in an earthquake. And seismic building codes are what describes how to connect our building's leg bones to their foot bones. So seismic building codes can get pretty specific for things like nail length and numbers of nails, which might appear trivial on the surface, but they're actually based on mathematical equations for each individual nail's ability to keep that skeleton of the building held together during an earthquake. And at the time of the 2018 earthquake in Alaska, they had adopted the 2012 International Building Code. But only a few of the larger jurisdictions actually enforced those codes. So after the 2018 earthquake, FEMA partnered with the USGS and Golder and Associates and the municipality of Anchorage to look at the damaged homes from the earthquake. And what we found was that there were more red tagged buildings outside of the areas where building codes were actually enforced. So red tag buildings, they're expensive. It's not just structural and content loss. It's social, environmental, and economic as well. And a recent study by FEMA, very aptly called Building Code Save, shows that by adopting and enforcing the seismic building codes, that the cost of damages is reduced during a disaster, and that codes can actually help communities get back on their feet faster by minimizing those indirect costs like business interruptions and lost income. So, long story long here. Alaska had adopted the 2012 International Building Code. Those damages observed from, a relatively small and short duration earthquake suggest that there needs to be improvements in code implementation. And so that could be, educating home builders on the intent and the application of those seismic codes and standards, as well as increasing inspections so that we can make sure that those standards are being met. And I know I'm kind of rambling now, but I know code and
no, not at all. Okay. No, it makes sense. I mean, it's not an atypical scenario that a disaster would kind of shine a light on both the strengths and the weaknesses in how a community, their requirements affect the performance of their buildings, how they recover, how long it takes, and then what happens on the policy front ensuing years. And it sounds like in Anchorage, there were some success stories, but not across the board. And that's, again, typical as well. So that opens up opportunities for improvement, which usually start with building codes. I love the way you describe that because it's perfect, especially for seismic and why those connections are so essential. But one of the things that's always tricky is as time goes by, we're nearing the end of 2020 as we record this. It's been 2 years. What's the environment like today? Do the leaders in Alaska and specifically Anchorage, I mean, if there was an initial recognition that there are opportunities for improvement, has that been sustained? And has that translated into any kind of policy improvements or better codes, or is there more work to do?
Yeah, so generally speaking, FEMA certainly encourages all jurisdictions to adopt the most recent building codes and to develop, robust inspection and enforcement processes. And we have a new grant program called BRIC, which stands for Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities. And I always like to joke that they didn't consult the seismic teams because seismic folks know that bricks are not what we should be building with. That's
right. That's a good point. But there's no K, right?
No, BRIC. It's the good kind of bricks, I guess. But this grant program provides funding to help communities identify opportunities for code improvements and to support code adoption and contractor training for, what the codes are and, how to do seismic design, and also support the enforcement of building codes and standards. And those grant applications all should be coordinated with the State Office of Emergency Management. But there's a lot of money behind those grants. And, FEMA is really trying to support communities in bringing more attention to their building code processes so that they're implemented. Our new study that Building Code Saves shows that adopting current codes, so that right now current codes is 2018, that results in an average annual savings of $60 million for earthquake hazards alone. So FEMA is very supportive of state and local adoption of building codes. And it looks like, at the state level for Anchorage, adopting a statewide code in Alaska is very complicated because of the sheer size of the state and the ability to properly enforce and implement codes can lead to increasing inequities if you're not supporting the locals in meeting that. So we're trying to work a bit more closely with the local jurisdictions to help them from their side on how do they adopt and enforce at their local level and help them identify what's vulnerable so that they can look at retrofitting and improving their code processes.
And that makes so much sense, Amanda, because just the stuff we talked about at the beginning, Alaska being an incredibly unique place with some challenges that come along with it on the sheer size of the state and then the diversity of the needs and the construction types. But I know that we're very excited about the BRIC program because I think it's fair to say that resources at the local level to adopt a code, maintain a code, enforce a code, train up and maintain a professional force to administer the code is a big part of the problem and has been in the past. So FEMA bringing those resources to bear for the code community to have a system in place to support that improvement is an essential element. And I think that the BRIC program is probably recognition of that. And I know that there's a lot of excitement about there, even though it's just getting started, because I think local leaders want the best for their citizens, but the resources and the needs and the stress against that, singular pot of money at the local level has to be stretched very far. So it's encouraging to hear that as that program is being implemented and coming into place, it's going to be able to help Alaska be prepared. Because when I always say this, but we're so aware and appreciative of building codes and better building practices. Unfortunately, our timing as a public is always a little off. It comes after the disaster, and the key is to get these things in place beforehand. Mm-hmm. And not everybody remembers 1964. I'm certain that you don't. But anyway, even for me, that was a pretty ancient history. But so it sounds like, from your vantage point and the work you guys are doing, partnering the communities there, that partnership in whether it's outreach or planning or, whichever aspect that drives resilience forward is really important. One of the things I was hoping to talk a little bit about before we get to the end is the kind of public-private partnerships that are advancing it, because those always serve as a great example for other communities who have the same goal. So do you have some of those that you think are especially key in advancing disaster resilience in Alaska?
Yeah. So at the very smallest level, after the earthquake, the number of local and private sector engineers that helped to conduct building safety inspections after the earthquake was incredible. I know that they're working on making that process more organized in the future, but it's just so neat to see the community come together for a cause. And then at a larger scale, it's been really fun for me to see the earth sciences community partner so well with the building environment community, the engineers and the planners. So after the earthquake, I met with so many partnership-based groups. So there's the Structural Engineering Association of Alaska, Siok. So you've got a group of engineers that were, comparing their findings and damages observed. You have the Alaska Planning and Design Commission, APDC, that was looking at what failed, what didn't, what worked well, what didn't. There's the Geotech Advisory Commission as well that helped us look at some of the actual ground motions compared to building performance. The State Seismic Commission is a group of engineers and state government folks and local building officials all gathered around, seismic issues itself. And then there's the larger groups like EERI, the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute, that's really helped take all of these observations of damages and put them together. And now all of these groups are partnering now with the American Planning Association to look at, we saw these problems. Now let's look at how do we fix them and how do we fix them equitably. And so that's kind of the next phase that we're into, we're 2 years after the earthquake. And then I guess I just want to do a little shout out to you at Flash. You've really helped us message building codes in Alaska, and you're also supporting a business continuity workshop for Alaskan business owners. I think we're looking at summertime of next year. So
Quake
Smart.
And we are working and recruiting, and I know you know this because I've already emailed you about it. We're building a very time-efficient advisory team for QuakeSmart because we're going to be bringing QuakeSmart 3.0 out and really enhancing the amount of building code content using real world case studies and examples like what you learned out of the 2018 event in Anchorage and others to help the business community and organizational leaders see the investment, the pre-disaster investments and how they pay off across the board, not just with codes, but with all different kinds of, structural as well as the planning aspects, as you say. So we appreciate the partnership too, because this is not a simple challenge and it requires so many different engaged stakeholders, to really bring it to fruition. I've heard you talk before about some of the other community partners and some of the different kinds of mitigation projects. Do you want to share a little bit more about that before we conclude?
Sorry, are you referring to like the school?
Schools, yeah.
Yeah, so we've definitely been working with schools in Alaska. They were some of the most damaged structures, and FEMA is working with them to identify grant opportunities to help retrofit and help make the schools a safe place to be.
Yeah, they're critical. So those efforts are fantastic. Well, this has been fantastic. Now, before we wrap up, I always like to ask if you only could tell our listeners one thing based on what you've learned and so far through your experience in Alaska and across the region that you serve, what do you think the most important message for them to take away from our conversation is?
Yeah, I sound like such a dork when I say this, but disasters are only disasters because of man-made structures. An earthquake or any other natural hazard, it doesn't have to be a disaster. We have the science, we have the engineering and the design to build stronger and safer and smarter. And we need local communities, the towns, cities, the boroughs, the counties, to prioritize upgrading their infrastructure. And that's kind of my plug. I'm a total geology nerd and I love the power of nature. That's kind of why I like Alaska so much. And, it would be so great if I didn't have a job, if we just all built for the geology that we are on top of, so that we could all embrace the power of nature rather than falling victim to it.
Well, I think that's a perfect thought. And as much as that's the case, I think that's a great jumping off point, because there are many out there that don't realize, and this is the power of your message, that it doesn't have to be a disaster, that there are things we can do, ways we can build, and strategies we can put in place to not just protect the people, but we can protect the place that they can come home to and continue on with their lives and bounce back. So I think that's just wonderful. I want to thank you again for being with us on this episode of Strong Homes, Safe Families. And I'd like to remind our listeners to please visit us at flash.org, Ready Business, to access the QuakeSmart tool that we talked about, which is under Ready Business QuakeSmart. There's a toolkit with information on how to prepare your family, your home, your business, your organization, and for earthquakes and for other things like power outage and the other kind of hazards we face, including flood, high wind, and more. Our content is available in English and Spanish, and you can always email us at info@flash.org or call us toll free at 877-221-SAFE. That's 877-221-7233. Please don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, rate it, share it, and give us a review on iTunes.